All right, hello, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation. I appreciate you being here today. And if you're watching on YouTube, I appreciate you watching and being a part of this presentation there as well. If you are watching on YouTube, I do encourage you to hit the subscribe button. That'll let you know when future presentations are uploaded. And if you have any questions and you're watching the recording, what you can do is if you have any questions, just go down into the comments section, write your question in there, and I will see that and come back and give you an answer as soon as I possibly can. So today we're going to talk about growing tomatoes, certainly one of the most popular vegetables in home gardens for a variety of reasons. We'll get into that. So we're going to talk about selecting varieties. We're going to talk about how we need to take care of our tomatoes, how we should harvest them, how we should store them. And as usual, we are going to talk about some of the insects and diseases that can be a problem on tomatoes. So I hope you're going to enjoy it and hope you learn something. I'd like to give a little bit of history as I start. Tomato is a solanaceous vegetable. It means it's a member of the plant family Solanaceae. And it is joined in that family by some other vegetables that we enjoy, like potatoes and peppers and eggplant. There are also some medicinal plants that are involved in that, some poisonous plants that are involved in that. Solanaceae sometimes gets called the nightshade family because one of the members of that is nightshade. Also, weeds like horse nettle, even some ornamental plants like petunias are members of that family. So a lot of plants that we see in the home landscape, for good or ill, are members of the Solanaceae. There, of course, are all sorts of legends about tomatoes being thought to be poisonous when they were first introduced to Europe. And it is true they were first brought in as an ornamental, though I don't think that the legends about them being thought to be poisonous for very long were true, because they've been cultivated in Central and South America prior to their introduction into Europe. Tomatoes are native to South America and in a wide area, particularly in the Andes, in northwestern South America. And there are still wild tomatoes there today that don't necessarily look like we would expect our common backyard tomato to look like. So in the top picture there, that is a wild tomato, one of the many different species and varieties that grow in the Andes Mountains. But by the time Europeans got to South America, they were already being cultivated and had kind of turned more into what we would expect a backyard tomato to look like, because they were cultivated in Central America for a long period of time. Of course, they were introduced into Europe and widely used by the 1600s. And over the centuries, they're now our second most important vegetable crop, at least economically, and at a commercial scale. Tomatoes are the second most important crop, second only to the potato, which of course has a wide production as well. But in terms of backyard production, tomato really is a major component of backyard gardens. And you'll also see a big market for that in farm stands and farmers markets because of the quality of those locally produced tomatoes. So tomatoes are popular for a lot of reasons. And when you ask people why tomatoes are really popular in the backyard, sometimes you'll see easy to grow as being a part of that reason. Now, I don't know if I'm going to qualify tomatoes as being the easiest vegetable in the world to grow. There certainly are some insect and disease problems we want to pay attention to that can make tomatoes a little bit frustrating, but they're certainly not terribly hard to grow, and you can certainly be successful with it. What's really great about tomatoes is that you can grow a relatively small number of plants and produce plenty of tomatoes for your family. A single tomato plant might produce anywhere, 15, 20 pounds of tomatoes, which can be quite a yield. My father used to joke his all the members of his Sunday school class were avid tomato growers. One of the few presentations I have ever given to a Sunday school class was about tomatoes. And at the start of the year, everybody was asking, who's got tomatoes? Who's got tomatoes already? By the end of the season, they were all putting them in baskets, knocking on their neighbors' doors, and leaving them there and running away. Um, the biggest reason for growing tomatoes in the backyard is because of the difference in quality of a backyard grown tomato and the one that you buy at a grocery store. And certainly what you're going to grow in your backyard is always, it's going to be a much better quality tomato, a much better tasting tomato than what you buy in the grocery store. And a lot of that has to do with how tomatoes are commercially produced and the varieties that you select and several other reasons. One of the big problems with tomatoes is once they're ripe, they just don't ship very well. They're a fairly fragile fruit. They're easy to bruise. And so ripe tomatoes can't be shipped long distances. So as a result of that, a lot of commercial tomatoes are harvested at mature green. So that's a stage of development in the tomato where it's reached its full size, but it hasn't started getting any color to it. And they harvest them that way because they're a lot sturdier. It's much easier to ship them. It's much easier to take care of them without bruising them or damaging the fruit. They're also going to last a lot longer in between the time when they're harvested and the time they're purchased at the grocery store. Now, sometimes they are, once they're being stored, they're exposed to a plant chemical called ethylene that's naturally produced by a large number of plants that results in sort of ripening. It will cause that color change and a little bit of textural change in the tomato, but they're not going to develop the full flavor. So, the plants don't have the time to put the sugars into those tomatoes that they would otherwise get if they were harvested a little bit later in their production. And we're going to talk a little bit later about when to harvest tomatoes in the backyard, because there are some misnomers or incorrect thoughts about how we should do that. So some things we should talk about when we are talking about growing tomatoes. Of course, we want to select a good site for them. We want to pick cultivars or varieties that are going to work well in the area that we're growing and may be resistant to different pathogens, may be resistant to different problems we may encounter. We also want to select varieties that are going to give us the kind of tomato that we want, because there are just a wide variety of different types of tomatoes out there. So we're also going to talk about how we're going to grow them. So we need to talk about planting and mulching and weeding, how we're going to support the plant and prune the plant, and how we're going to make sure that those fruit get pollinated. In terms of site selection, tomatoes are very similar to many of our other plants that we grow in the home vegetable garden. They require full sun, and I always like to make a comment that full sun here in Mississippi doesn't necessarily, whoever invented that term, I don't think that they lived in Mississippi, where we might get 16 hours of sun over the course of a day. So full sun would be 6 hours really at a minimum. And ideally, we want to have sun in the morning. So, ideally, morning sun and some shade in the afternoon is absolutely okay. It's actually kind of preferable. And they've done some work that shows, in areas like Mississippi, a little bit of shade can actually improve the production of tomatoes. You do want an area that's going to be open to good air movement. So one of the things that can really influence the progression or the development of any problems on the plant is for water to stay on the surface of leaves for a long period of time. Having good air movement in addition to some sunlight is going to help dry leaves relatively quickly, and that can prevent a lot of problems with the development of diseases. They do grow best in a loam to sandy loam soil, well drained. Tomatoes do not well tolerate heavy soil, and they certainly don't tolerate standing water for any length of time that's going to cause the roots to die off. And like a lot of our garden vegetables, again, a pH of about 6.5 is what we need, ideally, for the growth of the tomato plant. Now, selecting cultivars can be one of the most interesting parts of growing tomatoes simply because there are so many options out there. And there's a lot of things to consider when we think about what kind of tomato we want to grow. One of those is going to be the length of the growing season. So, tomato varieties may ripen relatively quick, may produce fruit and ripen relatively quickly, or they can take a relatively long period of time. So, the shortest, the quickest varieties of tomatoes may set fruit in as few as 50 or 55 days, while the longer maturing varieties may take over 100 days to produce fruit. And when we're selecting varieties, we want to think about the year that we have. So here in the very southern part of Mississippi, we're starting to approach the planting date for setting out transplants for tomatoes. Generally, I aim towards the end of March, the first week of April for a little bit further north, as being the date to put out tomatoes when they're going to do really well out in the landscape. As we go further north, of course, the winter is going to stick around a little bit longer, and you're going to have a little bit more delay as we get into to the start of spring. Now, the time limit then becomes, how late can we go into the year to produce tomatoes, and that can be really important because one thing that will happen with tomatoes as the temperatures start to get above 90 degrees, the plant will stop setting fruit. The pollen can't survive at those temperatures. So we have kind of a deadline, and we need to make sure that we select plants that are going to be able to produce fruit within the time that we have. Personally, I try to get all my vegetable plants, all my tomato plants out of the garden at the first to second week of July, because at that point the temperature is so high that it's really hot out, and I don't want to do it anyway. And they're not going to produce more at that point. So selecting early varieties or late varieties can be really important. We also want to select varieties that have the quality that we want. So we might want a cherry tomato that's really good in salads. I really enjoy currant tomatoes, which are even smaller, about the size of a blueberry in some cases. I think they just work fantastic as a snack or as something to put in salads. But a lot of people also want a really big beefsteak tomato that is going to be great for sandwiches. We also might be making tomato sauces, and for that, a paste tomato like a Roma variety is what we're going to want. So that's just a matter of selection of the qualities of the tomato that we're going to grow. And really, that all comes down to what we want to use them for in the once we actually harvest them. So if you want something for a salad, then those cherry tomatoes are going to be great. If you want something for a sandwich, you really want those nice globe or beefsteak tomatoes. Something for making sauces, those paste tomatoes are going to be great because they just have a lot more solid to them. Another thing that can be an important factor in cultivar selection is whether your variety is determinate or indeterminate. So a determinate variety will grow to a particular height and stop growing any taller. We tend to think of those as kind of being a little bit bushier tomato plants, whereas an indeterminate tomato is more like a vine, and it will continue growing indefinitely. Really important for us in growing tomatoes in cultivar selection is disease resistant. And there are a lot of varieties that have very good packages of disease resistance. Usually, you can find these in seed catalogs. Sometimes you can find it on the plant labels that you see. You might see at the store when you're buying transplants. So I put an example there of a Bonnie plant, not picking on them or promoting them in any way, but you can see the disease resistance on there. Right under determinate, it says disease resistance VFN, and that lets us know that it has resistance to verticillium and fusarium wilt, as well as some resistance to nematodes. And all of those can be serious issues in tomato production. And so, particularly if we know we have a history of those problems, selecting a variety that's going to have some of that resistance is going to be a really good option for us. Now, I have by no stretch of the imagination included all of the codes here. There are quite a few. And so, something you want to, possibly, work with your nursery person if you're going and purchasing the plants. Get in touch with your local extension office and ask about varieties that may be resistant to a particular problem, especially if you know you've had a history of that problem. Now, another exciting thing in tomatoes is the use of heirloom varieties. Now, the definition of heirloom varieties can be a little bit shaky. Sometimes when people say heirloom varieties, they mean a variety that is just a particular, if it's 50 years old, it's an heirloom variety. And there's really nothing wrong with that. But some of our hybrid varieties, some of the commercially produced varieties, have been around for that long. So sometimes when people say heirloom varieties, they might mean one that's been preserved by a family or by a community for a long period of time. The really interesting thing for me for an heirloom variety is, or there's two things. The first is that heirloom varieties are not hybrids. So a hybrid tomato is a cross between two different tomato plants that has some really good qualities that are going to really make it a stronger plant. But those hybrid varieties don't breed true. So the seeds that you get from those hybrid varieties are going to produce a tomato plant, but it may not have exactly the qualities of the tomato plant that you got the seed from. It's going to have some combination of the qualities of the two parents of that plant. Now, an heirloom variety will breed true. So you will have an heirloom plant that looks very much like your other heirloom plants. Now, there's a little bit of, just to give myself some wiggle room there, you do have to make sure that you pollinate it with the same kind of plant because you don't want those to cross. But the really exciting thing for heirloom varieties is there's just a fantastic amount of variation in taste and appearance. So really popular one. There's a Cherokee Purple is the variety that you see there in the top right. It's really notable. One, it's a wonderful tasting tomato. It grows fantastically in backyards. But it has a quality where it's exposed to the sun. The part of that tomato that is exposed to the sun will turn purple rather than the red color that we might expect. You can do a neat thing with young people in the garden. You can put a little bit of like a sticker on there or something like that. Where it's not exposed to sunlight, you won't get that color change. So just a really interesting plant. Brandywine is an old heirloom variety that's very popular because it's a really great tasting tomato. There's the yellow pear tomato that you see over there in the top right. Just has an interesting shape and color and kind of adds some interest there. And for a really weird one down at the bottom, there's the Reese tomato. Probably mispronouncing that. But they used to call them hiking potatoes, hiking tomatoes, or traveling tomatoes, where you pop off one little section of them because you can see all that really interesting kind of weird shape to the plant. It also has kind of an interesting kind of lemony taste to it. So all sorts of varieties. And what I do with heirloom varieties, I'm always going to grow some really reliable hybrid varieties in the backyard because I know I'm going to get a really good response from them. And I might always throw in a couple of Cherokee purples because they're just a really good tomato. But every year, I'll just pick one or two different heirloom varieties that are interesting and new and different, and it adds some variety and some interest to what we're doing out there in the garden. Now, whether a plant is or a tomato plant is determinate or indeterminate is going to make some pretty significant differences in how we deal with it and how we expect it to grow in the landscape. So again, a determinate plant is kind of bush-like. It's going to tend to be smaller. And generally speaking, they say that the fruit ripens all at once. It's sort of all at once. It ripens over a shorter period of time. So it might ripen over a period of several weeks that we're taking tomatoes off that plant. In contrast to a determinate plant, an indeterminate tomato is going to have a more vine-like growth habit. So it's really good for stakes, or if you have overhead supports, you can do that, and it will continue to grow essentially as long as you can keep it healthy, and it will continue to put on tomatoes. And it tends to put them on over a longer period of time. Ultimately, you wind up with about the same amount of tomatoes over the course of a season. It's just a question of whether you get them all at once or whether you get them in or relatively all at once or over a slightly longer period of time. My experience and my advice for that, what I prefer determinate tomatoes as what I'm growing. So I'll get some shorter season ones, medium season ones, and some long season ones. And that way I have all the tomatoes that I want throughout the growing season. Starting tomatoes from seed is very easy. You do want to start them about 4 to 6 weeks prior to the last frost date for your location. You do need to look that up. Um, I usually start tomato seed right about the first week of January, and that is just me hoping for an early spring. So I'll start some again a couple of weeks later. Seed are extraordinarily inexpensive, and usually I have a whole bunch of them. So I don't mind if I have some plants that we have a cold snap, and we don't make those out into the garden. Generally speaking, a soilless mix, so any regular potting mix that you purchase at a big box store or garden store will do just fine to start your tomatoes. Or you can use a peat mix or a core mix as the material for starting those seedlings. All of those work perfectly well. You do want to make sure that they're watered evenly throughout their growing season. If you start the seeds, they break dormancy because they're exposed to water. Then they are going to, you can't let them dry out after that because that will kill the seed. Once those seedlings have come up, it is a good practice, start giving them a little bit of fertilizer. I use a liquid fertilizer. There are a lot of those out on the market, Miracle Grow or Peter's Best, which I think was bought by Scott's recently. Um, give them a little bit of fertilizer every 2 weeks. That's just going to support the growth of the plant, make it grow a little bit more vigorously. And then as we're getting ready to get them out into the uh, garden, um, we want to harden them off. And some of the older recommendations for hardening off plants would be, exposing them to cold. And what we figured out is that it's better to harden off tomato plants and some other vegetables by changing the amount of water that they get. So as we're getting right, in a week or so before we're ready to get them out into the landscape, you can let them dry out a little bit just to where they start to get a little bit of droop to them, and then water them. And doing this several times will have actually a better benefit than exposing them to cold for hardening them off and toughening them up for being out in the landscape. Now, I know that a lot of people purchase tomato plants rather than growing them from seeds. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Um, if you do purchase transplants, just keep in mind that when you're doing that, the largest tomato plants that you can grow that they have are not necessarily going to be the best ones for the landscape. You really want the relatively smaller transplants that have a really good, healthy root system. Pull them out, make sure that root system is good and white. Make sure the plant isn't root bound, has a good stocky stem, good deep green color. And you want to avoid any transplants that have flowers on them or any transplants that might already have fruit on them. Now, it's certainly, you see flowers and you think, oh, this thing, this is going to produce plants really, produce fruit really, really quickly. But what that can be is a sign that that transplant has been stressed, because a stressed tomato plant will start flowering early. Now, staking and training tomatoes, this is often a question I get. Basically, we're staking them or caging them in order to keep them up off the ground. That does help out with disease control, because a lot of the pathogens that we're worried about are kind of held over in the soil. So lifting that tomato plant up off the ground is going to help negate some of that disease. The other thing we're doing by staking or caging them is just making them a lot easier to work with. It's easier to see the plant and to work with the plant by having it, raised up rather than vining or flopping along the ground. Um, we'll talk a little bit, for staking plants. You want to stake them in plants generally about 24 inches apart. Just tie twine to the stake and loop it loosely around the plant. You don't want to tie directly on the plant. That tends to put a lot of pressure on the stem of the plant. You can actually cause it to break. You also don't want to put a tie immediately below a fruit cluster. That can cause the plant to snag, and it'll actually strip the cluster off of the plant. So you want to put those ties, every few inches up the plant, maybe every 6 inches, just to make sure that they're adequately supported. And you need to keep an eye on the plant as it grows, because you're going to need to continually add new supports to the plant to keep it growing up on that stake. Caging is a little bit simpler. So you just put them about 3 feet apart. They'll still grow just fine. Put the stake down around, put the cage down around the plant, and you can do that essentially right after you put transplants out in the soil. The cage is already there, so you don't have to worry about that. If you're going to use cages, that tends to work a lot better with a determinate variety than it would with an indeterminate variety, because that bushier habit tends to work well in a cage, while the vining habit doesn't work quite as well. Another popular way of supporting tomato plants is using what's called a Florida weave. This is what I use at home because it involves driving less stakes into the ground, and I don't have to buy or make a bunch of cages. And to do this, you generally will put stakes in the ground every 2 tomato plants, and then you run a line between those posts into the ground on either side of the plant in order to support it. And you can have a long line of plants done that way. It's relatively easy to just add new line as the plant grows. And if you kind of keep all the plants up, it's a little bit less labor intensive to do it this way. And now pruning plants is going to be a little bit different if we have a staked tomato or if we have a caged tomato. For a staked plant, again, usually this is an indeterminate variety. We're going to select that one main stem, and then the sucker that develops immediately below the first bloom cluster, which is going to be a really good strong sucker. One sucker below that, everything down from that we want to take off. We want to remove any parts of the tomato plant, any leaves that might be in contact with the ground, because we don't want any disease problems. And you're going to you are going to remove some suckers. Particularly, you're really wanting to remove them when they're about 2 to 4 inches in length. because once they get bigger than that, it's kind of traumatic to the plant to remove those. If you're, keep in mind you do need to leave some of them higher up, because the suckers are where you're going to be getting the production of fruit. So we do want some of those suckers to be on there, but all of those suckers can essentially turn into a whole new tomato plant. So we're going to have to keep the size of that plant a little bit smaller. Caged tomato plants, we generally want to prune those to 4 or 5 main fruiting branches. See a good picture of that there. As the plant grows, you just keep turning the ends of those branches back into the cages. Caged plants do tend to produce a little bit later than a staked tomato, just because there's a little bit more vegetative growth, and that can slow down the development of fruit a little bit. But they also tend to have a little bit less problem with cracking, which they do in response to heat variation or variation in water, and a lot less problems with sunburn, because you have a lot more leaf material there to kind of give the tomato plant a little bit of shade. Now, I say we want to remove suckers when they're 2 to 4 inches long. Practically speaking, I know many times when I have tomatoes in my backyard, I don't do as good a job as I would like to with making sure I remove those suckers in a timely fashion. So there is something called Missouri pruning that we can kind of use as our rescue there. Um, if that sucker has gotten longer than about 4 inches, we can do what we call what's called Missouri pruning, and we're just going to take the tip off of that sucker, leaving 1 or 2 leaves. We're removing a smaller section of the sucker. That actually has some benefits, because it is going to provide more leaf area for the plant. It's going to be able to photosynthesize a little bit more. And in addition to that, the fruit are generally going to be underneath that. Now, having a few extra leaves there can give it a little bit of shade to help protect it from a little bit of that sun exposure that can be damaging to the fruit. Now, tomatoes are also really popular in containers. I grow all of my tomatoes at home in containers. And I think a 5 gallon container is really the ideal size to go with when you're growing a tomato plant in a pot. That being said, there are some dwarf varieties, like I mentioned down below on this slide, and they can be put in a 3 gallon container and do perfectly fine. But my thinking on that is that if a 5 gallon container, having a bigger pot is rarely a problem. So going up a size is never a bad idea. Tomatoes grow fantastically in containers. You do still need to give them some support. Um, and you will need to carefully monitor watering for your tomatoes, because they don't do well drying out and getting wet. That can cause some significant problems. So carefully monitor your watering. You will need to increase your fertilization to, just to make sure, as we're adding water, fertilizer will run out from the soil. So we need to make sure we're giving the plant all of the resources it needs. And again, a determinate variety in a container is going to be preferable. There are some dwarf varieties out there. They just grow smaller plants. They're not quite as big. Still produce a fantastic tomato. Often a little bit smaller, but still, perfectly well sized for use in sandwiches and things like that. 2 varieties. Patio is a good classic one, and Patio Princess is another really good variety of dwarf tomatoes. There are many more out there. I'm just mentioning a couple of them in very brief. Now, when to harvest tomatoes is another thing that people often ask. And sometimes people think that the best thing to do is to harvest the tomato when it is fully ripe. And that can be a little bit of a challenge, because you're competing with all of the insects or other problems that might happen to that tomato along the way. So once tomatoes reach what we call the breaker stage, where they're about half pink and maybe still have a little bit of green on them, um, that's the breaker stage. And at that point, the tomato plant actually walls off the section of the stem of that growing tomato, So the tomato is no longer receiving any sugars or other things from the plant. At that point, they've got all the stuff there. They're just kind of continuing the process of ripening. So that is the best time to go ahead and harvest them. Um, and they'll continue to ripen. The tomato fruit responds to ethylene, and so it will continue to ripen and get really good and red as it ripens off the plant. You do want to store your tomatoes in a cool, dry location. Again, they release that ethylene gas. You can slow that ripening process down a little bit if you separate out the red and green tomatoes. The red ones are going to cause the green ones to ripen faster. The other thing that affects ripening speed, of course, is temperature. We don't want to put them in the refrigerator, but if you put them in a cool place where the temperature is going to stay a little bit lower, they will ripen slower than they would if you put them in a hot location. I know a lot of people put tomatoes on a windowsill where they're going to get a little bit more temperature to get them to ripen faster. Now we are going to talk a little bit about some of the bugs and the diseases that can affect tomatoes. With a little bit of attention and some monitoring of plants, one of the best things we can do in the home vegetable garden to defend against any of these problems is to go do the thing we enjoy the most, which is spending time out in our garden. If you catch these problems when they're small, they're going to be relatively easy to deal with, and you're going to have a great tomato product. So recommend, if you can, once a day. If you can't, every other day. Get out there and look at your plants and see if you have any problems so we can go ahead and take care of them. Thrips are a common problem on tomatoes and a few other crops, quite a few other crops. They tend to damage the leaves or the flower buds by puncturing the plant, feeding on sap. They can cause the leaves to curl up. The real problem with thrips is they're really hard to see. They're a very small insect. They're maybe a 1/16 of an inch long or a little bit bigger than that. So one thing you can do is just get an index card, particularly tap the flowers over that index card and see if you see any little bugs running around on them. Very likely, if you do see anything, what you're looking at are thrips that are in the flowers of the plant. The common thrips that we see are the flower thrips and the western flower thrips. If you ever want to win Jeopardy, remember that the singular form of thrips still has the S on it. It's still a thrips. Aphids, a common problem on just about everything we ever grow in the landscape. All sorts of different aphids that are out there feed on the plant by piercing the plant tissue with a mosquito-like mouth part, sucking out the sap. Do transmit some diseases, some virus diseases of tomatoes. But primarily, they produce a lot of honeydew, which can cause sooty mold on the plant. And they do just overall reduce the vigor of the tomato plant. What we really want to do for looking for these, make sure we look at the underside of the leaves because that's where they tend to accumulate first. And their populations can grow very quickly. So if you detect a few of them after several days, that population can be quite large. Third insect that kind of is going to wind up being dealt with the same way is a whitefly. These can be very aggressive on tomatoes sometimes, particularly in protected structures like a high tunnel or a greenhouse. Really easy to detect because they're very very good flyers. So if you tap the plant, you will see little white flies flying all around, and they feed on the plant very similarly to the way that aphids do. And again, can reduce the vigor of the plant, can transmit some virus problems to the plant as well. In terms of managing all of these, whether it be thrips or whiteflies or aphids, insecticidal soaps and neem oil both work very, very well. It's just important to make sure that we get good coverage of the plant in order to fully control the population. With a lot of these, what we're trying to do is kill the immature stages that are less mobile. So it may take some repeated applications. and you may have to be a little bit patient to get effective control. Pyrethrins can work. Um, Very effective in a number of products out there that also work for control of these. We do get some beetles that occasionally feed on tomato plants. The most common one I have seen are the cucumber beetles. There's a picture of one of those on the top left there. That's the banded cucumber beetle. There's also a spotted cucumber beetle, or the 12 spotted cucumber beetle, and a striped cucumber beetle. Also, of course, pests of cucumbers. But we also may run into a few other beetles like Mexican bean beetles and things like that. Tend to feed on the leaves. That doesn't tend to be incredibly serious, but they can also be damaging by feeding on the fruit. You can see a picture of that. Oftentimes, we don't see very many of the beetles, so looking for that damage can be pretty characteristic and can let you know that you've got a problem. Now, the absolute bane of the tomato grower is the stink bug and the leaf-footed bug. Didn't include a picture of a leaf-footed bug, but they're brown and have more of a long body shape, and their hind legs have kind of a leaf shape to them. They do give off an unpleasant odor if you handle them or you crush them. They lay eggs underneath the leaves and they suck sap kind of the same way that an aphid does. But the big problem with them is that your fruit wind up looking like the bottom of that picture there, where the inside of that tomato kind of gets hard and won't mature after they have fed on the plant. So huge decline in the quality of the tomato. If you start seeing stink bugs, you really do need to go ahead and apply a control for them in order to get rid of that population as fast as you can. Caterpillars, there are again quite a few different caterpillars that you might see on tomato plants. The army worm, which you see down there on the bottom, is a common one. The tomato fruit worm, which is up in the top left, and of course the tomato hornworm, or more properly, the tobacco hornworm, is another serious pest of tomatoes. They can damage the plant by feeding on leaves, but also by directly feeding on the fruit. Really importantly, with caterpillars, the easiest time to control them is when they're small, because the options for what we can use to control them are going to be a little bit broader. Um, in terms of controlling beetles and stink bugs and caterpillars, I'm going to talk about them a little bit separately, and go off script for my slide here. Beetles, bifenthrin, which is sold as Ortho Bug Be Gone or Garden Insect Killer, it will be very effective. Spinosad, which is another chemical, is also fairly effective for beetle control. Um, just to respond to a question, all of the caterpillars that I've talked about are safe to handle. You can hand pick them off the plant. You don't have to be worried about that. I should probably do a presentation sometime soon talking about those. But the caterpillars that you're likely to find on your tomato plants are not going to be the ones that have stinging hairs on them. So you don't have to be worried about that. Control of caterpillars, if you can catch the caterpillars when the individual caterpillars are still small. So they've just hatched out, they're maybe a quarter of an inch in size or smaller than that. The best chemical for control of caterpillars is BT. So Thuricide, or Bacillus thuringiensis, is very effective at controlling caterpillars, and it really only works against caterpillars. So it leaves all of the other bugs that are around intact. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't see them until they're larger. And so going to bifenthrin or something like Bayer Advanced concentrate, which is cyfluthrin or spinosad, would be effective. Now, for I know some people are interested in organic gardening, and of course, sometimes that can be a challenge here. But spinosad both spinosad and BT or Thuricide are organic labeled products. Pyrethrum or pyrethrin, which is another organic insecticide, can also be used for control of beetles and for caterpillars. Stink bugs can be a real challenge. Stink bugs are very difficult to control with insecticides. You can try a range of things. Generally, in my experience, spinosad may have some effect when they're very small. So if you can catch them when they're little, you'll get a lot more effect out of that. Pyrethrum will kind of knock them down, but they tend to get right back up. So often with stink bugs, we resort to more powerful or traditional insecticides in order to get effective control of them. The new version of 7 insecticide, which I believe is a pyrethrum derivative. I'll have to look up the actual chemical because I don't want to say the wrong thing there. It does have some pretty good efficacy against stink bugs, but they can be very difficult to control. If you start to have a population in your garden, it's a good idea to make sure you stay on top of that. We are going to talk about diseases of tomatoes. There are quite a few out there. I have a mixed play slide here. Protect your beneficial insects. Try to use insecticides that are as targeted as possible in order to preserve these so that you can keep the populations of other bugs down. Probably the most frequent question I get about tomatoes is how to deal with blossom end rot. It is a perennial issue, and I see all sorts of recommendations for how to deal with it. It's adding eggshells to the garden or adding Epsom salts to the garden. Really, the problem with blossom end rot, while physiologically for the plant, it is a result of a calcium deficiency. So at the growing tip of the plant, those cells need that calcium. They can't take it from anywhere else in the plant. And so those cells start to die off at that growing tip because if they're not getting the calcium they need. That being said, it's really uncommon for there to be a calcium deficiency in the soil. The problem is that the plant has to take up that calcium continually. And if there's some interruption in the watering and in the water uptake of the plant, that growing tip of the plant won't get the calcium it needs. So make sure you're monitoring your soil moisture. If you are planted in the ground or in containers, I highly recommend a drip irrigation system that's going to maintain that good uniform soil moisture. And that will really diminish the amount of blossom end rot that you see. There are calcium products that you can purchase, like Rot Stop or other things like that. And adding a calcium supplement like that, that's highly mobile, that's already in a way that the plant can take it up, you can see a little bit of a decline in the blossom end rot that you'll see. Adding eggshells take a very long time to break down. So, unless you did that quite a long time ago to make sure there was calcium already in the soil, as a treatment for blossom end rot, that's not going to be very effective. You do want to make sure you're not adding too much nitrogen. As the plant's growing really actively, it requires more calcium. And if you do see fruit that have blossom end rot, just remove those. When you first see the problem, you don't want the plant to put a lot of energy in trying to grow that fruit. And often you'll see blossom end rot on the first few fruit, and the problem will kind of resolve after that. Nutrient deficiencies or nutrient toxicities. Nutrient deficiencies are far more common. I don't see very many of these. And really the best way to solve this is just make sure you do a soil test, apply fertilizers according to those recommendations, and you shouldn't see a lot of these problems. They do crop up fairly, a little bit more commonly with some of the micronutrients. So adding a micronutrient fertilizer with the other things that you're adding is never a terrible idea. Watering can be a serious issue for tomatoes. We do want to make sure that we give them even water. Either drought or overwatering can be a serious problem. Generally, in the ground, an inch of water per week. But in a container, you're going to need to watch that a little bit more closely, or even in a raised bed, because that raised bed or that container is going to lose water a little bit more quickly. Getting into some of the biotic diseases or biotic pathogens that affect tomatoes, there are several viruses that affect tomato plants. Tomato spotted wilt is one of the more common ones. It has a really large host range, results in the plant will wilt and have ring-shaped spots, particularly on the fruit. You can see a couple of pictures of that. Best way to manage this is either have a resistant variety. Make sure you take care of any thrips populations you have, because that is how they get transmitted to the plant. Um, Another example of a viral disease is tomato yellow leaf curl. One of the great things about virus diseases is they're just named for the symptoms that they produce. So the leaves turn yellow and curl. They are transmitted by the white fly, sometimes called the sweet potato white fly, or several other names. Um, so making sure we're controlling white flies is very important as well. Bacterial spot will show up occasionally. You see these symptoms on the lower leaves more often. You can see a really good picture of that in that top picture there, where you see those kind of yellow expanding spots on the foliage. That foliage will stay on the plant, kind of giving it a scorched appearance. And you will see spots that kind of look scab-like on the fruit. Um, I have an old school slide here with the with animations. I apologize for that. Bacterial wilt is a very serious issue, as in tomatoes, simply because the bacteria get into the vascular tissue of the plant, and result in the entire plant wilting off, and they can wilt off very quickly. It's very important, if you start to see this problem, that we remove the plants from the area as quickly as possible, because that will help prevent transmission from one plant to another. As the plant breaks down, those bacteria get re-released out into the soil. So we want to make sure that we remove any part of that plant that can serve to affect other plants. There are several fungal wilts that can affect tomato. Fusarium or verticillium are two of the more common ones. Um, Infection again occurs through the roots. These are really more common in areas where the soil is very wet, and you start to see the plant wilt generally from the bottom upwards. If you cut the plant or cut a stem of the plant, you'll see that brown discoloration of the foliage. Again, very difficult to treat with fungicides. So you just want to remove those plants to prevent them from being able to transmit to other plants. The most common disease that I run into, particularly with seedlings, is Pythium root rot. It's very easy to diagnose because you pull the plant up and you pull at one of the roots, the whole outside of the root will come away, kind of like taking a sleeve off, leaving a tiny little steel or the central little core of that root sitting there. Um, Causes the general wilted plant a lot more common. This is really a water mold rather than a fungus. So we tend to see this in areas where there's a lot of water, more than the plants would really require. So making sure we manage water is going to be very important to managing Pythium root rot. Southern blight, you're going to wind up seeing kind of a white fungal growth at the base of the plant, causes the plant to wilt. Mulching is a really important control for this, because we want to prevent the plant from coming in contact directly with the soil. That's not going to help for the actual base or the root crown, but it will prevent it from affecting the fruit or higher areas on the plant. Um, One defense for this is actually wrapping the base of the plant in aluminum foil, because that will prevent the fungus from being able to get in contact with the plant. So occasionally you will see the base of tomatoes wrapped in something like aluminum foil. to prevent them from getting southern blight. Early blight is absolutely the most common problem of tomatoes. Every time every time I see tomatoes, at least some of them have early blight. And I really consider this, all of our production is really a race against the early blight taking out the plant. It tends to happen on the lower leaves of the plant more quickly. See a really good picture of the symptoms there on those leaves. Can also affect the stem. You can see a picture of that. We call it collar rot when it's doing that. Or it can affect the fruit. But that leaf damage, starting at the base of the plant, moving upwards with brown lesions, with yellow around them, general chlorosis of the leaf or yellowing of the leaf is very, very common. And in my mind, just makes it necessary to apply some fungicides to control fungal problems in tomatoes here in the southeastern United States. Septoria leaf spot, another really common fungal disease. Really distinctive lesions that we get on the leaves. They have that white center with a brown circle around it and then yellow around the brown. Gives us a really good indication that that's the problem. If the conditions are right for the fungus, those lesions can kind of group together. But less of a common problem than early blight, but still something we see fairly often. And I think the last last fungal disease I'm going to mention is late blight. Um, this is you generally will see some curling and some kind of grayish lesions on the leaf. Often you'll see blackened lesions on the tomato branches, and that blackened lesion on the tomato branch is probably the most common symptom I see of late blight on tomato. And you will see some damage to the tomato fruit as well. You can see that kind of large, kind of darkening of the fruit as a symptom of late blight. Root knot nematodes. Of course, that's a small unsegmented worm that lives, or roundworm that lives in the soil. The female attaches to the plant and feeds there, lays all her eggs, and makes that gall around the roots. Symptoms tend to be that the plant will not grow as actively, may wilt, particularly when temperature's higher, and can be very difficult to manage. Using resistant varieties is really important. Not necessarily growing the moving to a different plant. So moving to something that's not going to be susceptible to nematodes, and moving your tomato production elsewhere can be important. One other thing that can be effective to help with nematodes is growing French marigolds. They release a chemical out into the soil that nematodes don't like. So that can help kind of drive those nematodes away a little bit. I use this slide whenever I'm talking about disease because I think these are the 5 important components of properly managing diseases in the home landscape and in larger scale than that. Probably the most important note there is sanitation. So if you if you clean up any residue of plants, remove any plants that may seem to have a disease problem, you're not allowing the population of that disease organism to set up shop in your landscape, in your garden. And so keeping a clean garden is the most important thing that you can do. Making sure that you're giving the plant all the correct level of watering is really going to help with some abiotic problems, particularly blossom end rot, and making sure that we apply water at the base of the plant rather than on foliage can help manage a lot of the disease, a lot of the bacterial or fungal problems, because they require 6 or more hours of leaf wetness in order to propagate on the leaf. Now, there's nothing we can do about rain, but we certainly don't want to add any more water to that to extend the period of time those plants are going to be wet. Making sure you have good morning sun, good air movement through the plant by proper pruning is also going to help with that. Mulches, having that barrier between the plant and the soil, are going to help with that sanitation process. keep the fruit clean. They're also going to help moderate temperature. So when it's really cool out, if we put our tomatoes out and the temperature drops down a little bit more than we would like, having that mulch there is going to give them a little bit of insulation. And on the contrary side of that, if we get a really hot day, having that mulch there is going to help preserve soil moisture and help to prevent the plant from wilting as a result of that high heat. Resistant varieties are a really good, cheap way of helping deal with the problem. So, making sure that you have a variety that's resistant to some of the problems that you may have encountered is going to be a really good idea. Doesn't cost you anything, so it's very, very effective. And of course, you want to make sure that if you do purchase transplants, you want to make sure that they look healthy when you purchase them. You're not transplanting any sick plants into your home garden. The final comment on that, after all of that, is when we apply fungicides. There are certainly some good fungicides that can be fungicides and bactericides that can be used for tomatoes. Commonly, people will use myclobutanil. A trade name of that is Spectracide Immunox. Chlorothalonil, which is sold as Daconil and a few other names, are very commonly used to deal with a lot of fungal problems in tomato production. Copper products are commonly used both for fungal problems and give a little bit of helpful control against bacterial problems. But it's a really good idea to make sure we have a good, proper diagnosis of what the problem is, and then base our recommendation on what fungicide we might apply based on that. So, with that, I appreciate your time and attention today, and I will be very happy to answer any questions that you may have.